So we're going to start tonight. This is the story of the Akeidat. Everyone knows the basic story. It is a troubling story, to say the least, of Abraham taking Isaac, bringing him to Mount Moriah to be sacrificed, and then being stopped. We all know the basic story. Why it's done on Rosh Hashanah is a very interesting question. Why it is done on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, it's an interesting question. All right, it's read on the second day of Rosh Hashanah as the Torah reading, which of course that's Brianna's bat mitzvah, and it's going to be very interesting. But there's a lot of questions and things beyond that I want to raise, and we're gonna read the materials tonight, and we're going to talk about some of the questions that are raised. And I have some very good materials for us that will raise some questions to you, and then of course I have a twist at the end that I like to talk about. So, which is what I usually do when I teach the classes. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. All right. That worked.
Michael, can I just interrupt for 1 minute?
You may.
Or may I interrupt? Well, I don't see everyone now, but I wanted to start off by thanking Michael for, quote unquote, volunteering to teach in the Elul programming, because we have a full calendar, as everyone knows, for each night of Elul. So we thank Michael in advance, and we hope everyone will join for other programs as well. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Elaine. So again, if you're not speaking, please mute, because otherwise what ends up happening is everybody else hears what you're saying and they don't hear the speaker. So if you're going to make a comment, you can unmute and then mute back up when you're done. I'd appreciate that. So we start off with Bereshit chapter 22, which is the Akeidat. And remember where we start before that. There's a couple of things that you have to remember. One of the things you have to remember is that Abraham has two sons. The first one being Ishmael, the second one being Isaac. Ishmael is born to Hagar. Ishmael gets sent away by Sarah, who says she doesn't want him near her son. And so Abraham reluctantly agrees. When God says to him, listen to your wife, Abraham agrees and Ishmael is sent away. So now we have the only son that's still living with them is Isaac. And Isaac, of course, is the son that was born in a miracle. We know that because Sarah was old and Abraham was old when this happened, beyond the time of childbirth. And so after all those other things that happened, it starts off in Bereshit chapter 22 that says, and it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham, he said, here I am. First question, what is the test? What type of test is he giving? We're going to explore all these questions, okay? Second, in the second verse, he said, please take your son, your only one, whom you love, yea, Isaac, and go away to the land of Moriah and bring him up there for a burnt offering on one of the mountains, of which I will tell you. So now he's saying, take your son, your only one. Abraham has more than one son. Why is God saying, take your only son? Probably because Ishmael's been sent away, but we know Ishmael's alive, and we know Ishmael can become a great nation. And so we go forward on this, and Abraham doesn't go immediately. He waits until the next morning, because unlike other times when he's told go do it, he goes immediately, gets up and goes. Here he waits till the next morning. He gets up the next morning, he saddles his donkey, he takes two young men with him, and he takes Isaac, and he brings the split wood for the offering. And Isaac has to be thinking to himself, what? Well, he's thinking to himself, okay, we're going to have a sacrifice. That's fine. We're going, why do we have to travel all this way to do a sacrifice? And Abraham now travels. They travel together for 3 days. Question, what are they talking about during those 3 days? Abraham, Isaac, and the two young men are traveling together. What are they saying to each other? Isn't there some questions that arise? The Torah is very silent about this. And exactly what is Isaac thinking while all this is going on? If he knows anything about this, he's saying, well, okay, where are we? Why are we going so far away from this? And Abraham says to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad, who was about 37 years old at that time, will go yonder and we will prostrate ourselves and return to you. He's not telling them that there's going to be a sacrifice at this point. We're going to prostrate ourselves and return to you. And that's the interesting thing. If you look at the line, he says, we will go and we will prostrate ourselves and return to you. It's still part of the we, he's saying to them. That's fascinating. What do you think is in his mind? Abraham then goes and he takes the wood for the burnt offering and he placed it upon his son Isaac. Isaac has to carry the wood, and he takes into his hand the fire and the knife, and they both go together. And Isaac now, for the first time, speaks to Abraham and he says, Father, and he says, here I am, son, Hineni, son. All right. And he says, here are the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? What are we going to offer? And Abraham says, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And they both went together. Now, do you think Abraham knew at this point that God was not going to allow him to sacrifice his child? Mark says no. He's shaking his head no. Interesting question, though. Then they come to the place where God had spoken to him, and Abraham built the altar and arranged the wood, and he now ties up Isaac. Now, Isaac's 37 years old. Think about this. If your father said to you, listen, let me have your hands, I'm going to tie up, I'm going to sacrifice you. You think you would just stand there? The question is Isaac also being tested here? Is Isaac being tested to see if he is a viable successor to Abraham? And it's a very interesting question. There's a lot of commentary on this. And so he binds Isaac and he places him on the altar on the wood. He stretched forth his hand with the knife to slaughter his son. And the angel of God calls to him from heaven and says, Abraham, Abraham. And he says, here I am. By the way, remember, look who's calling him from heaven. God tells him to go. Who's calling to him from heaven? An angel of God, not God. Important things to remember as we go through this. Do not stretch forth your hand to the lad or do the slightest thing to him, for now I know that you are a God-fearing man, and you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me. I know because you were willing to sacrifice your son that you care more about me. Very important. And Abraham lifted his eyes up, and lo, there's a ram, and it's caught in a tree by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham named that place, the Lord will see, as it is said on this day, on the mountain the Lord will be seen. And he said, by myself I have sworn, said the Lord, because you have done this thing and you did not withhold your son, your only one, that I will surely bless you and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars in the heavens and the sand in the seashore, and the descendants will inherit the cities of your enemies. Wait a minute, didn't God promise this twice before? The same promise? Why is it only because now he's going to do it? Didn't those promises made? Is God saying, well, I may have welched on my promise previously? It's a very interesting question. And he says, and through your children shall be blessed all the nations of the world because you hearken to my voice. And Abraham returns with the young men to Beersheba, and they arose and they went together to Beersheba, and they remained in Beersheba. But where was Isaac? Where did Isaac go? Okay. And that's how it ends. Now, there's more to the chapter, but that's how it ends. So we have to move on and start talking about some of the commentaries. And I have I pulled out different commentaries from both Reformed, Conservative, and Orthodox sources. And they have different flavors to them. So Jerry Blum asks the question, pass or fail? On the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we read the Akeidat story, All right. What is its relationship to Rosh Hashanah? Well, simply because the ram's horn. The horn is blown from the ram. Okay, that's the reason it's red, according to this source. Why is it infamous? Because of the controversy over testing Abraham. I mean, it is quite controversial. And what she says is, when I was a child in Hebrew school, I was taught that God was testing Abraham by telling him to sacrifice his beloved favorite son. The test was to show that his love for God was even greater than his love for his son by obeying this command. And we praised Abraham for passing the test, one of the great things. And she says, but I heard a young rabbinical student postulate that Abraham actually had failed the test, not had passed it. Well, theologians, both Jewish and Christian, have for centuries seen in this that Abraham's love for God superseded his love for his son. Now, in the post-Holocaust era, scholars, a lot of Jewish scholars believe that Abraham failed the test. He argued with God over the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, but he never argued with God to save his son. Think about it. Why would he do that? He asked God not to slay the innocent in Sodom and Gomorrah with the guilty, but he didn't argue to protect his son. What kind of person was Abraham? Torah says that the two Abraham and Isaac, walked together, climbing the mountain to build the altar. But after sacrificing the ram, instead, we do not see them descending to death. In fact, Abraham leaves with the two boys. Isaac, where is he? And we know, by the way, through a lot of scripture and a lot of review, that Isaac actually goes to Hagar and spends time with her. So, nor do we see any more interaction from there and after between Abraham and Isaac. We never see any interaction between Abraham and Isaac after the sacrifice. And we don't see any more contact with Sarah, because we know in the next parsha, what's the first thing that happens? Sarah dies. In fact, some say that Sarah's death is a result of the shock that she had as a result of what has happened in the Akeidat. But not only that, God never talks to Abraham again. There is not one instance after the Akeidat that God speaks to Abraham. Only the angel speaks to Abraham. And so, the question is there a disappointment? Is there a punishment now for failing the test? Is God really asking Abraham to say no to this as he did before? And of course, we know Abraham was told to stop. God does not want human sacrifice. We're aware of that. In fact, the Torah has repeat over and over again, do not sacrifice your children to Molech. But yet, testing Abraham by asking to sacrifice his child, as he had already sacrificed one to the desert, not knowing whether he would survive. So, did Abraham pass or fail the test, is the question. And that's the question we start with in looking at this entire process. So at this point, does anybody have any ideas, thoughts, comments? Okay, then I'll keep going. So the second source is a Chabad source, all right? And he asked the question, Tzvi Friedman asked the question, why didn't Abraham plead for his son's life? Again, he says the same thing. Why did Abraham protest so strongly on behalf of a handful of low-life sodomites, and yet submitted silently when commanded to sacrifice his own son? And so they say, concerning his responses, concerning Sodom, God informs Abraham that the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah has become great, and their sin has become very grave. I will descend now and see whether, according to the cry which has come to meet what they have done, I will wreak destruction upon them. Okay, and it's very similar, by the way, to what happened with Moses and the Israelites with the golden calf. God says, I will annihilate them. And in both instances, Moshe and Abraham fight and say, wait a minute, you can't just annihilate everybody for the sins of the few. It's the wrong thing to do. If there's even anyone that is innocent there, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, you can't annihilate the whole town. And here, the question is different. Because here, God says to Abraham, please take your son. He's asking. He's not directing. Please take your son. He then understood that this was something, according to this source, that Abraham then understands that this is something not to argue about. And Speed Friedman goes on and says, we have a deep relationship with God. We aren't just robots. Man has free will. There are times of prayer, where we argue with God concerning the way he runs the world. And there are times when we just need to accept. Not so comfortable with accepting all the things that I know a lot of other people aren't. Abraham wanted to avert a punishment intended for the people of Sodom. The binding of Isaac, according to Steve Freeman, was not a punishment. All right, it was supposed to be a great privilege for Isaac to be sacrificed to God. I'm not comfortable with that either. I see your face. Okay, I shake my head every time I see that also. So how then do we understand what was going on here? Well, let's take another look at it from a different angle. And I have to turn this, so please be with me for a second. Okay, here we go. So Torah Sparks, and if you knew, anybody know Rabbi Joel Levy? He was the Rosh Yeshiva of the conservative yeshiva in Yerushalayim. Incredible teacher, wonderful guy, very, very smart. And he asked the question, was there something special about Abraham that caused God to pluck him from obscurity and enter into a covenant with him? All right. And in early part in Bereshit, it says, for I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and that they shall keep the way of God. What was so special about Abraham? That he will be able to command his children and his household after him, after his death, he will be able to enforce the fact that they will worship just one God. And according to the reading of this verse, Abraham is special, right? Or God chooses him because Abraham knows that Abraham will be capable of creating an ongoing self-sustaining community that will preserve God's message. But there are other people that could have been worthy, but only Abraham was able to command his children and his household after him. Think of those words, command his children and his household. There was no question that they were going to do what he said. So the question is, something special, what was something mythologically special about Abraham's capacity to create a self-perpetuating religious tradition? All right, was what was going on? And the question is asked, is continuity enough? All right, but Connor Cruz O'Brien says it's not. It is not enough just to have continuity. That's one of the issues. Continuity doesn't have to be a religious concept. Continuity is just perpetuating a people, something. And when they said, when Connor O'Brien said this in 1956, all right, representatives sat in alphabetical order of their nations of the United Nations, all right? And Israel and Ireland sat between the representatives of Iraq and Israel, all right? And he was led to ponder whether religious traditions are really just another unpleasant facet of nationalism. Is this really nothing more than nationalism? Is that what we're talking about? Well, the Abrahamic traditions may be good at self-replicating. They continue. But so, he said, are flu viruses. And we know that goes with COVID viruses today. God may have known from the outset that Abraham could be relied upon to perpetuate God's message. But it is only at the end of the Parsha, after the story of the binding of Isaac and Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his beloved son, Rabbi Levi says that God comes to know that his desire and ability to perpetuate is not merely an expression of self-interest. It's not because Abraham cares about perpetuating him and his thoughts and his ideas and his people. He says it's about more than perpetuating God. And he said, and he goes on and says something very, very important. He says, liberal Jews often eye our illiberal Jewish cousins with a holy envy for their apparent capacity to command their children and their household after them. It is something, we sit there and we look at and we say, look at the Orthodox family. Look at what they do. They're able to perpetuate the religious values in a way that we haven't been able to. They command their children, you will do this, and the children follow. For the most part, we have a different issue. We cajole, we hope, we do the best we can to move them in the right direction, but it's a different issue. And he said that it does seem to be true that various aspects of religious fundamentalism seem to contribute to high levels of cultural transmission. Fundamentalists believe in the pristine source of your own canon, a tendency towards social isolationism and exclusion of outsiders, a declared belief that one's elevated status in the eyes of God, a focus on particularist rather than on universalist religious motifs, heightened sense of practice of altruism, turned almost exclusively to insiders. All of these things do contribute to cultural continuity. But he says, continuity is not God. Sometimes we are motivated by our desire for self-replication. And thus we're intended to use the tools of fundamentalism in order to continue ourselves. But Jewish continuity is a good thing for the world, but only if it is motivated by a desire deeper than cultural inclination. Okay, the idea is that we can't simply be there in order to perpetuate ourselves and our own thoughts. If that's what we're doing in religion, then we're making a terrible mistake because we're not doing what it is that God is doing. So God's test to Abraham, according to Rabbi Levi, is to make sure that Abraham was not doing it for the wrong reason, doing the right thing for the wrong reason. And he says, God knows that at the start of the Parsha that Abraham is capable of guaranteeing continuity. Only at the end of the Parsha does God know that Abraham does not worship continuity and that he will not sacrifice his deepest values on her altar. By being prepared to sacrifice his son, he is articulating in the deepest possible way that continuity is not God. He was promised over and over again that he would be a nation of great people. He would be the father of that nation. And yet the son that's supposed to be the one who creates the nation is to be sacrificed. And Abraham is willing to do that in order to be able to make sure that it is God that God is the important thing, not his own self-perpetuation. So all of this sounds very interesting, but of course, as those who study with me regularly know, I usually end up turning to Rabbi Sachs. All right, we always have to have Sachs as part of this because Rabbi Sachs is a flavor that is so different than anyone else, and this one to me may be the most satisfying answer of all. Rabbi Sachs says in the binding of Isaac, take your son, your only son, the one that you love, Isaac. And when you read this, you say, what is the conventional reading? Well, the conventional reading of the passage, Rabbi Sachs says, is that Abraham was being asked to show that his love for God was supreme. Exactly what we heard from both of Chabad and both from Rabbi Levi. So he would show this by being willing to sacrifice his son for whom he had spent a lifetime waiting. The conventional reading of this passage in that way says, why did God need to test Abraham? Why did he need it? All right, Maimonides answered that God did not need Abraham to prove his love for him. Rather, the test was meant to establish for all time how far the fear of the love of God must go. You must be willing to do anything for God, including sacrifice your child, according to Maimonides. And on this principle, there was little argument. Kierkegaard wrote a book called Fear and Trembling, all right, all about this. Ethics is universal, consists of general rules, but the love of God is particular, Kierkegaard said. It is an I-thou personal relationship. What Abraham underwent during the trial, says Kierkegaard, was a theological suspension of the ethical, meaning his willingness to let the I-thou love of God overrule the universal principle of that human beings are bound one to another. That sacrificing someone, a human being, is a bad thing, but you are willing to suspend it to the basis of God's, because God wants you to. Now, Rav Soloveitchik explains that the episode, in terms of his own well-being, all right, characterization of religious life is a dialectic between victory and defeat, majesty and humility, man the creative master and man the obedient servant. There are times when God wants us to be creative and be the master of our own determination, and there are times that God says, you got to do it my way, and we have to do it his way or her way. And Rabbi Sachs says these are the conventional readings and they represent mainstream of tradition. But he argues for a different interpretation. And he says there are four problems. He starts with there are four problems with conventional reading. One, we know from the Tanakh and independent evidence that the willingness to offer up your child as a sacrifice was not rare in the ancient world. In fact, it was commonplace. And in fact, the Tanakh mentions it many times, not only here, but later on when you start reading the Judges and the Kings and the prophets, how horrendous that is. And in fact, absolutely forbidden to sacrifice your children. You shall not sacrifice your children to Moloch. In fact, Moses tells the children of Israel that as well. You shall not do what they do in those other places. So child sacrifice was widespread. It was a normal pagan practice. That's number one. Number two, it says child sacrifice is regarded with Torah throughout the Tanakh, all the way through. Micah asks rhetorically, shall I give my firstborn for my sin, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? And he replies, he has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does God require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with good God. How could Abraham, Rabbi Sachs asks, ever be the role model for the father when he's prepared to do what his descendants were commanded not to do? How could he be that role model? Third, specifically, Abraham was chosen to be a role model as a father. God says of him, for I have chosen him so that he will instruct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. And how can somebody be a role model who's willing to sacrifice his child? In fact, who's willing to do it without even arguing with God, without saying, wait a minute, something's wrong. If you want me to prove, why didn't he say to God, if you want me to prove to you how much I love you, then take me as a sacrifice, not my child. Let me be sacrificed. Fourth, very Jewish parent, by the way. That's a Jewish parent way of doing it. Fourth, as Jews, indeed as humans, we must reject Kierkegaard's principle of theological suspension of the ethical, according to Rabbi Sachs. He says this is an idea that gives carte blanche to religious fanaticism. And God does not ask us to be unethical. In fact, quite to the contrary. God wants us to go beyond the Torah. In fact, when we study Devarim now, Moses says specifically, do what is right and what is just. In Parsha Re'eh, we read that. It says, do what is right and what is just. Go beyond the Torah. Go beyond the teaching. Make sure that what you're doing is right and just. So Rabbi Sachs goes on and says, well, folks, we're going to reject those other ideas. He says, to understand the binding of Isaac, we have to realize that much of the Torah, Genesis in particular, is a polemic against the worldviews that Torah considers pagan and human in law. And if that's the case, how can we look at this in that way, that this is what God wants? Well, what were they revolting against here in this idea? He says, before the emergence of the first cities and civilizations, the fundamental social religious unit was the family. The authority in that family was the father. He was the head of the family. And he would decide everything. The paterfamilias was absolute. He had the power of life and death over his wife and his children. Right? And this idea even went beyond the biblical era into the Roman principle of patricia potestas. And the Torah is a rebellion, an opposition to every element of this worldview. It is looking at it in a different way. All right. It is succession. One of the things you need to know, that succession, all right, seeking the spirits of the dead is not allowed. Succession is not passed just to the firstborn. The Torah specifically takes that away. And if you look at it, it's not the firstborn son who gets the succession. It's the child that deserves to succeed. It is those things are rejected by people. So the principle of the entire story of Isaac from birth to binding is opposed to the idea that a child is the property of the father. Rabbi Sachs on. He says, first, Isaac's birth is miraculous. Sarah is already postmenopausal when she conceives. And just like Hannah, we read Hannah's story also during the High Holy Days. Just like Hannah, Sarah is unable to naturally conceive. That's why when he's born, Hannah says to her, says, I prayed for this child that the Lord has granted me. So now I give him to the Lord, for his whole life will be given to the Lord. And Abraham is told when he's about to sacrifice his son, now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. The test was not whether Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son, but whether he would give him over to God. Not to sacrifice him physically, but to give him over to God, to surrender his life to God. That God would be the guiding source of Isaac's life the same way it was the guiding source of Abraham. What God was doing when he asked Abraham to offer up his son was not requesting a child sacrifice, but something quite different. He wanted Abraham to renounce ownership of his son. He wanted to establish as a non-negotiable principle of Jewish law that children are not property of their parents. Where do we see that here? Well, if you go back to the very beginning of the Parsha, it says, please take your son, your only one whom you love, yea, Isaac, and go away to the land of Moriah and bring him up there for a burnt offering. It doesn't say kill him there and sacrifice. And so Rabbi Sachs takes this in a different direction. He now says that there is a different principle. All right. He says the same principle that existed here is something special. And he says, what if the three of the four matriarchs found themselves unable to conceive other than by a miracle? The Torah wants us to know that children that they bore were children of God, all right, rather than of a natural outcome. They were special. Children of God. It was God that gave the gift. I remember when Brianna was born and we named her a month later on Rosh Chodesh. All right, she born on Rosh Hashanah and named the next Rosh Chodesh. And one of the things we said when I did that is that I said, this is a gift from God. Got to say goodbye to my son. So this child is a gift from God, a gift to us to raise, but not something that we own. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what Rabbi Sachs is arguing. He's saying that Abraham was being taught, and through Abraham we were being taught that our children are gifts. They are not us for us to own. And beautifully done on Rosh Hashanah is a good time to remember that. The clearest evidence of this interpretation is given at the birth of the human child, Rabbi Zach says. When she first gives birth, Eve says, with the help of the Lord, I have acquired a man. That child whose name comes from the verb to acquire was Cain, who became the first murderer. He said, Rabbi Sachs says, if you seek to own your children, all right, your children may rebel into violence. As long as parents believe that they own their children, the concept of the individual could not be born. The Torah represents the birth of the individual as the central figure in moral life. Why then did God say to Abraham, offer him up as a burnt offering? To make clear to all future generations that the reason Jews condemn child sacrifice is not because they lack the courage to do so. Abraham is proof that they do not lack courage. The reason they do not do so is because God is the God of life, not death. In Judaism, as the laws of purity and the right of the red heifer showed, death is not sacred, death defiled. So there's Rabbi Sachs' explanation. To me, much more pleasing than the others. But I want to flip the story a little. One of the things that really troubles me about the Akeidat, and it's something that really fits within the holiday motif for the high holidays. As we said earlier, Abraham never sees or speaks to Isaac again. Never. Abraham goes and finds him a wife and everything else, but never speaks to Isaac again. Abraham never speaks to Sarah again because she dies. There is something broken here. Abraham was broken also in the fact that he lost his son Ishmael, which he eventually recovers, which is interesting. But in this story, we do not see the kind of coming together of a family that was broken apart. Because nobody says they're sorry. Nobody asks for forgiveness. Nobody tries to put things back together. If you look later on in the stories, in the Torah, following this, we know that Abraham goes ahead and gets a wife for his son. We know that he makes sure that Sarah is buried properly. But then what he does, which is really astonishing, is he goes back to Hagar. And he now reestablishes his family. Despite the fact that he did this, at least he could put together some of his family. And if you read on, it'll say he lived to a grand old life of 175 years, I believe. All right. And he had many more children and was able to rebuild his life because he learned it. See, one of the problems that we have is when something like this happens in our family, and believe me, it won't be this serious, but certainly there will be things that happen to break up our family that we have to learn how to put them aside, to ask for forgiveness, to try to mend things. And Abraham, unfortunately, loses this until he passes away. Because then we see his sons Ishmael and Yitzchak coming together to bury him. How sad it took until then. How sad. And so in this spirit of the high holidays, that we're supposed to be asking forgiveness, if we do it with a full heart, it is a better chance that we'll be able to mend only the breakages that we have. And so that's how I take this story another step beyond. So I'm happy now. I know we have questions and commentaries and ideas and thoughts. So please, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and please just, unmute to say something, and only one at a time, please, so that this way we can keep some order. Who has some ideas, thoughts? Oh, come on. Nobody?
I do.
Okay, go ahead.
I have a question.
Sure.
And that is the reference is constantly to Yitzchak as Abraham's only son. So we all know that he had two sons. Is he the only son because he's the son of Sarah?
He's the only son because he's the son of Sarah, because he's the miracle child, because he was the God's miraculous child. And more importantly, he was the successor. That's the reason he was the only son. And that,
Thank you.
other questions, other ideas, other commentary? Too much silence. Yes, Sheila, unmute.
Leaving aside like your son, your only son, to me it was reminiscent of the beginning of Lech Lecha, when Abraham is told, leave your home, your father's house, your birthplace, like all these adjectives and different details, convincing him to leave. So maybe what Abraham was thinking was, well, okay, I had to do something really hard then and separating from my father, and God was showing me the way. So yes, it's my son. Yes, it's my favorite, but maybe somehow these two stories are connected.
All right, so how do you connect it? What's the connector?
Well, just the detail, like it's repetitious, but it's not repetitious, like the finer details of, like in Lech Lecha, he's told, leave home and follow me, but it doesn't just say leave home, leave your house, your father's house, your birthplace, all these, more detailed connections to leave and follow God. Here, the connections obviously are already there. It's his son, it's his special son. If we don't say, adapt the reading a little, not your only son, maybe your favorite son, and somehow connecting that God is leading you to someplace special with a purpose, with a destiny. I don't know, just the language of the verses to me was like a little bit of a connection there.
See, the difference between the two that I see, all right, is there's never a situation where he says, leave your father who you love. Go away from your father's house who you love. Here he says, take your son who you love. Not go fight for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Go ahead and take your son who you love. Abraham is on a journey. There's no question about it. But the journey that Abraham is on is a journey of faith. Okay? There is an absolutism here, and that's why most of the commentators, traditional commentators, are Abraham has to prove absolute faith in God. I have some problems with that. It means we're not allowed to question. I think that leads to a fundamentalist concept that is not Judaism. I always, and the people who study with me regularly know that one of the things I teach is God gave us the greatest gift that mankind could ever have, free will. God gave us the greatest curse that mankind could ever have, free will. And then he goes around and he picks the Jewish people and he says, here's a guidebook, guys, to have a good life. If you follow the guidebook, you exercise your free will with intelligence, with love, with caring about other human beings, you're going to have this great life. You'll get the rain, you'll get this, everything will be wonderful. You will have a good life. If you don't, not going to be so good. Okay? Because you have this problem. Now, God is, if God is saying, hey, listen, you got free will. Well, Abraham has a right to exercise his free will. He could say to God, why are you taking my son? I love him. Kill me. I have no problem. Just like Moshe says later on, hey, don't kill them, kill me. I can't deal with them anymore. I can't deal with you anymore, God. Kill me, not them. It is fascinating that I think that we learn from this. Sometimes, by the way, sometimes we learn from the negative in our Torah. We learn from things that we shouldn't do. And perhaps maybe we're learning a little bit what we shouldn't do. Like Rabbi Sachs says, we shouldn't try to own our children. We shouldn't mandate what they are going to do. We should guide them, bring them into the world, teach them correctly, teach them as much as we can, show them the right way, show them by example the right way. And they will naturally follow us and maybe hopefully succeed and exceed us. That's the concept. And so maybe that's what really was what maybe Abraham failed the test in certain respects. He failed the test because he didn't fight for the freedom of his child. He didn't get it right away. Yes, Mark.
I disagree with you. Abraham didn't fight for his child because it wasn't his child, it was God's. And he had no right to negotiate something like that. In Sodom and Gomorrah, in those places, he was asking God to exercise mercy. Here, God saying, hey, I lent you this kid, I want it back, so to speak.
Very good, Mark. Like that. Marty, Judy.
Well, from my perspective, he was 37, Isaac was 37 years old. So he was not a child in the sense when the average person thinks of the term child, a 37-year-old person who, as you mentioned, didn't resist in any way, shape, or form. It's kind of a very strange story in that respect. Also, you mentioned that Abraham hooked up with Hagar later and had children. They had to be special too because he was in his mid 150s when he had them. So it's not exactly that that Isaac was the only special child, because apparently he was well prepared to have many children.
Isaac was a special child because I'll tell you why Isaac I thought was a special child. And I always say that the hero of this story, other than the angel who tells Abraham don't, is Isaac. Isaac is actually being tested as well. Isaac is being tested to see whether his faith in God and his father will actually hold up. All right? He has to say, hey, listen, I know that God will never allow this. So I'm going to have faith to go meekly onto the fire and allow my father to go through the ritual, knowing where is the lamb? God will provide. Where is the sacrifice? God will provide. I think Isaac is actually a hero. Yeah, Iris.
Okay, well, God promised that you're going to have children, you're going to have so many descendants that it'll be as the stars in the sky and the sands on the beach. And how is that going to happen if Isaac is gone? I mean, I guess he had this feeling that it's not going to happen.
You mean Abraham knew that God was going to put a stop to it. I think there is some reading here that tells you that maybe that's the case. All right? Because Abraham waits until the morning. And by waiting until the morning, he had time to think about this. And he said, God is really not going to make me sacrifice my son. It's not the way his
That's
way.
why God will provide. And he did at the last minute.
It's a fascinating look. There are so many wonderful facets to this story, which is what makes it so interesting for the high holidays. So
you're saying that Abraham went through with this whole grand plan because he knew it wasn't going to happen? That's kind of belittling his faith, isn't it? No, I'm not. It's not belittling his faith. In fact, it is exactly in his faith because he knew, in his heart, he understood what God wanted. He understood that God never lied to him. When God would say to him, you're going to be the father. Remember I said multiple times, he said, God, you're going to be the father of a great nation. Going to carry on your traditions and all, right? He said they'll be more numerous than the sand, and all those things were told over and over again to Abraham. He had to believe God from the beginning that God would never break his word to him. Yeah, but the same thing. He could have ended up sacrificing Yitzchak, right? And then he went on after Sarah to get another wife with more kids. Maybe they're the ones who are going to make the nation.
It's possible, Mark. It is possible. But like I said, these are just different interpretive readings from the same thing that we can come up with all different ideas, which makes it so interesting. And yes, Gail, unmute. You got to unmute, Gail.
Sorry.
Unmute. There you go.
Yeah,
Good.
sorry. Maybe there's a hint. I know that they're concealing the true purpose. Abraham was concealing the true purpose of Isaac and the journey to Isaac. But when he says, the boy and I will go up there, we will worship and we will return to you. So maybe at that point he felt, I'm coming back down with Isaac. I'm not going to leave him up there. I'm not going to sacrifice him up there. So that for me, that's always been curious and maybe a hint that he wasn't going to sacrifice Isaac.
Yeah, and again, there's another little hint of things that may be an interpretation that you can look at that says, you know, Abraham had such faith in God that he knew even when he lifted that knife that God was not going to let him do this. Maybe that's the faith. Maybe the test is that he had faith enough in God to know that he would not end up sacrificing himself. Yes, Miriam.
Then maybe it's that Abraham knew that he wasn't going to come down without Isaac, but Isaac decided he wasn't going to come down with him.
Well, Isaac, I think, you know, when you realize and you look at Isaac's personality, all right, Isaac is probably the blandest of
Very vanilla.
What's that?
Very vanilla.
Very vanilla, very bland. Yeah. He continues Abraham's work. He digs the same wells. All right. He is very, very, look, and you got to remember, you know, when he gets his wife, when Rebecca comes, all right, for the first time, he says he loved her and he was finally calm. He was finally feeling okay. Maybe he was PTSD. All right. He's sitting there going, Dad had a knife over me. You know, PTSD goes once to Hagar and he spends time with his brother Ishmael and Hagar to try to get himself out of his PTSD. His mother dies. That now throws him into another tizzy. All right. His father tries to kill him. His mother dies. He's freaked out. And Rebecca comes and soothes him. But if you notice, and by the way, and there's in no other place in the Torah does it talk about husband and wife fondling each other as it does it talking about Isaac and Rebecca. There is a tremendous love there because maybe what Rebecca did is pull him out, but Isaac is sort of vanilla. He's a nice guy. He digs the same wells. And interestingly, when they keep filling those wells back in until he digs new wells, until he goes out on his own for the first time, he's not even recognized. The Philistines stop filling in his wells when he digs his own wells. At that point, they stop. It's really fascinating when you look at him, but he is a bridge, effectively, from Abraham to Jacob in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And you will, you know, you feel for him. I mean, this poor kid 37, I mean 37 is still a kid for me, all right, is freaked out. This makes him nuts. All right. And he had to take time to recover from this. And when he does it through continuing to do his father's work. All right. And this means that's very important because he's doing his father's work, even though he stopped having this relationship with his father, which I think is fascinating. It's fascinating. Okay. Helene?
Yeah, I was just reading something because as people know, I'm doing one of the sessions on this topic. So I was reading something earlier, and I think it might apply to why Isaac is so vanilla. And they're talking about the doubling of names, where in the different parshiot, like Noach is Noach, and then Moshe, Moshe, and Yaakov, Yaakov, and their names are repeated. And it says here that for the exception of Isaac, and his name was not repeated because when he approached the altar to be sacrificed, the soul that was in him in this world left him. And because it is said of Abraham, quote, blessed are you who resurrect the dead, so only the soul of the world to come was returned to him. So maybe that's why he became so bland and allowed himself to be, or his world was so much part of Rebecca. I don't know. It's just a thought.
It's fascinating, you know, soul leaving sounds like a lot like PTSD, doesn't it? You know, it's kind of like you remove yourself from the world, and that's what happens with people with PTSD. So, yes.
Just to put in a word for Kierkegaard, I don't think any of us would agree with his conclusions, but he tells the story several times, like different midrashes of different ways that it could be. And one of the stories that he tells is just like what Talene was just saying, is that Isaac never believed in God again after that he was traumatized and he never said anything to anyone about it, but he never believed in God ever again. But I really recommend Fear and Trembling by, at least the first part of Fear and Trembling is a wonderful Christian group of midrashes about this story.
By the way, Fear and Trembling is a wonderful, I studied in college also, and it's just a phenomenal work. Very hard to get through at first time. The second time was a little easier to get through. You start to read it in a different way.
The first few pages are easy to get through because that's where he tells the story several different times in different ways.
Yeah. Anyone else? All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. This has been a wonderful session. I'm so happy that you all participated. And I look forward to seeing you at other of the programs that we're going to be doing. I'm going to try to attend as many as I can. Some I can't. We'll be traveling, but you know, and I hope to see your faces on the screen at the same time. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating. That's the most important part. Keep thinking. Keep asking questions. It's the way. It's our Jewish way to ask questions, even if we don't have any answers. So everyone, an early Shana Tova. All right, have a good, sweet, and happy and wonderful New Year filled with peace and love. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.
Okay, good night.
Good night. Thank you.